Jamal sat in the cold walls of the courtroom, questioning for the first time if justice truly existed. Jamal sat on the hard wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly on his knees. The courtroom was filled with the quiet sound of dozens of people breathing, yet he was utterly alone. He glanced at the defense attorney standing just in front of the judge's bench, a public defender. Jamal knew he'd probably picked up the case a few days ago, barely skimming through the details of his story. Jamal knew he was innocent, but it hadn't taken him long to realize that the truth didn't matter here. He'd been accused, falsely, of robbing a convenience store. Allegedly, he'd been caught on the security cameras, but at the time he'd been on the basketball court in his neighborhood, dribbling down the cracked pavement. He could still hear his mom's voice calling after him, "Don't be late." But no one cared to listen to his mom. No one cared to listen at all. The judge sat above them all, his expression stoic and cold. The prosecutor stood confidently at the podium, his voice calm but cutting. He wasn't just accusing Jamal of theft. He was tearing into Jamal's character, painting him as nothing more than another street kid. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, addressing the jury, "just because the defendant doesn't have a record doesn't mean he's innocent. Jamal Johnson matches the description perfectly and has no alibi that can hold up under scrutiny." Jamal's eyes shifted to the jury. A middle-aged white man scowled at him from the corner of the box. A woman avoided his gaze entirely, her pen scratching quickly against a notepad. Only one person, a young woman, seemed to actually look at him, but her face was unreadable. If there was any glimmer of hope in her expression, it was nowhere to be found. The rising tide of injustice swelled in Jamal's chest, quickening his pulse. These people didn't know him. They didn't know his name, his story, his life. To them, he was just another young black man, a statistic in the wrong place at the wrong time. "They're not going to hear me," Jamal thought, his jaw clenched tight. "It doesn't matter if I scream my innocence. They've already made up their minds. Even if my mom stood here and swore I was home, they wouldn't believe her." His eyes drifted to the room's edges. Everything about it felt cold, impersonal. Wooden benches, towering flags, and the word justice engraved in bold letters behind the judge. But there was no justice here. The prosecutor wrapped up his argument, his voice ringing with certainty. The jury was attentive, nodding slightly. Then Jamal's attorney rose to speak. He tried to appear composed, but Jamal could tell he wasn't prepared. He spoke briefly, mentioning Jamal's character and how he'd been elsewhere when the crime occurred. But his words barely rippled through the room. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, Jamal felt a knot tighten in his throat. He already knew what their verdict would be. And when the jury returned, their faces blank and unreadable, he braced himself. Guilty. Of course. Guilty. Time seemed to slow as the judge read out the sentencing. The words blurred together in Jamal's ears, distant and muffled. "I was always guilty to them," he thought bitterly. "Because of my skin. Because of where I come from. They didn't see me as a person. They saw a threat." As the courtroom emptied, Jamal stayed seated. He didn't move, his head cradled in his hands. A police officer tapped his shoulder, silently gesturing for him to leave. Jamal rose slowly, his eyes cast downward, and followed him to the door. Outside, he looked up at the courthouse's towering stone columns. They stood tall and unyielding, as if bearing the weight of justice itself. But all he felt was the crushing weight of the injustice beneath them. As he stepped through the doors, one thought consumed his mind. This isn't my story. This is theirs. They've just stolen my voice.